This is Diana Sullivan in Austin, Texas. This is a video of techniques from this particular Afghan, the long triangle short row graphics Afghan. It's part of my An Afghan in a Day or Less series, and it's available as a digital pattern over at www.dianaknits.com. Now this Afghan, by using short row graphics, gives you a very striking geometric pattern, but you do not have to take the time and fuss with intarsia. It's fast and easy. It also has hems all around, which gives you extra width and very sturdy edges. Edges on blankets seem to get the most wear. We also have a very interesting corner detail on this Afghan. Let's get started with the technique. Sometimes when I put a hem on the top, I use a row of ravel cord, but in this particular case, I don't need a marker row because my last row was white and now I'm going to do a gray hem. The outside of the hem is knitted first, and I'm going to do 14 rows for the outside of the hem. There is no change in the tension. Now when you knit the next group of rows, instead of knitting 14, you need to knit one less because the last row will be formed from the sewing of the hem. So I'm going to knit 13 rows after the eyelet row. I'll be back after that is done. Now I have 14 rows for the outside of the hem, the eyelet row, 13 rows for the inside of the hem, and I need to measure off enough yarn to sew the hem. So I'm unthreading the machine, and I need 3 times the width of the knitting, and I always take some extra for luck. That yarn is just hanging from the machine, which is now unthreaded. And I'm going to knit off on waste yarn. I'm going to hand feed that for my waist knitting until I run out. I'll have plenty of waist knitting at the top of the blanket to hold it safely while I sew the hem. Here's the last of that waist knitting. I'm going to knit on the rest of my row, knit back, and the blanket will fall off the machine. So I'm catching it with the other hand. Well, what you're looking at in my lap is the blanket. I have threaded that yarn in a needle, and here's the blanket. Here's the hem folded into place the way it will go. So the sewing job involved here is to sew this row of gray loops to this row of gray loops. And this is actually pretty easy. What we're going to do is we're going to go down through this gray loop and come back up through this gray loop. Just like that, and then pull that through. There are other ways you could do this, but I am going for a perfect match for the bottom of the blanket. Now, I unroll this and I find the very rightmost gray loop that's in between the white and go down through that gray loop and up through that gray loop. In other words, just like I did at the waist yarn side of things. And there's a lot of pulling when you've got 3 times the width of the blanket, so I pull and pull and pull the yarn through until this is folded into place the way it's going to be. And I don't pull it totally tight. There's a little stitch there, and that little stitch should be the same size as a row of knitting. Now, don't worry about getting it perfect. It will be fine. Just don't pull it totally tight. Now, I go in the same gray stitch I came out of. See, this was my yarn. I can tug on it and see. That's my yarn coming out of this gray stitch at the waist yarn. So I go down through that stitch, up through the new stitch to that stitch's left, pull that one up. Oops, I should be under there. I'm holding that together and adjusting my stitch size, which I think you can see. I'll zoom in as much as I can. So those were the 2 stitches through the waist yarn gray loops. Now I go back to the white yarn gray loops. So I go in through that same gray loop as before. See the thread coming out of it? Here's some gray thread coming out of it. So in through that gray loop and curve up and come up through the next one on the left. So this is going to be that same stitch over and over. And on this far right end of the blanket, I do a lot of pulling up, but no worries. As we go across, there'll be a whole lot less to do. Now I go back in that same gray loop that I used before on the waist yarn side of this and come up the next new one. Every loop will be used twice. Pull that up, then go to the next one down here and bring that around and come up the next one on its left. And I'm going to pull that one up. The waist yarn is left on as a stitch holder until you have it stitched all the way across. And this is exactly how it's going to look. So I'll do a few more stitches and then I'm going to finish this off camera. But it's going to be the same thing all the way across, down from the top, curve over and come up from the bottom. And I simply do that until I've joined the entire bottom of the hem. Now, I am left-handed and I was demonstrating how to sew this right-handed, but if you'd like to see how it's done left-handed, I've flipped things around and I'm doing it left-handed so that I'm not all day getting this sewed together. And I am just doing the same stitch up here on the gray stitches in between the colored waist yarn as I'm doing down here on the gray stitches in between the white yarn. Sometimes people ask me, what can you make with a knitting machine? And they're usually not knitters. And I say, well, anything you can knit. So that would be a sweater, a blanket, a glove, a slipper, anything you can knit. And then sometimes I get to thinking, what would the people who watch my videos like to learn to knit? So if there's something you'd like to learn to knit on a knitting machine, please put that in the comments. Now, I'm at an interesting spot here. Maybe I can zoom in just a little more. Up here, I have 1, 2, 3 more to do. And down here, I have 1, 2, and that'll work fine. So, when I get on across, they're going to match up very nicely. And you know, when I'm in doubt about whether to put one more stitch in, I put the stitch in. So I'm going in there, and then I'm going in this little twisty thing because it's really all that's left. And then down here, what can I do? I will go here and go in that little twisty thing because it's all that's left. And now I had plenty of yarn. I didn't have to add any. I can unravel this scrap yarn. So here it comes. I am unraveling it and rolling it up. Be right back and show you what this looks like. Here is how our finished hem looks on the inside. And to compare that to the bottom of the work, the reason I did it, I wanted to get something that matched the bottom. So that's the bottom, that's the top. The thing that doesn't match about it, of course, is the color change. But that is a very, very good match for that kind of hem.